The wind caught her skirt in front of a millionaire CEO, but his reaction shocked everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. Elena Moore had learned how to disappear in plain sight long before that night, long before the wind turned her into a spectacle. She was 23, a freelance event assistant paid by the hour, the kind of worker whose name never made it onto guest lists or plaques. On the evening of the Croswell Foundation Gala, she moved quietly between marble columns and silk gowns, clutching a clipboard like a shield, counting tables, checking wristbands, keeping her eyes down. The hotel plaza glowed under chandelier lights spilling through tall glass doors, and every inch of the space whispered money, power, and certainty. Elena owned none of those things. Her dress was borrowed, hem-stitched by hand that afternoon. Her heels were half a size too big. She told herself it was just another job, just another night of blending into the background until the check cleared. Outside, the crowd gathered for the final photo call. Donors laughed. Cameras clicked. Names worth millions floated through the air like currency. Elena stepped forward to signal a timing cue, just one step too far into the open space. That was when the wind came rushing down the avenue, sudden and sharp, funneling between buildings like it had a purpose. The fabric of her skirt lifted violently, exposing more than she ever intended, freezing her mid-step as gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones rose. Someone laughed. Someone else whispered. Elena's mind went blank. She couldn't move, couldn't cover herself fast enough, couldn't vanish the way she always did. Heat flooded her face as every second stretched unbearably long. She felt smaller than she ever had, reduced to a moment she couldn't control. Across the plaza, Julian Cross saw it happen. At 35, the CEO of Croswell Group was used to watching crises unfold from a distance. Numbers crashing, reputations wobbling, entire rooms holding their breath for his response. He stood surrounded by board members and city officials, impeccably tailored, unreadable, the kind of man whose silence alone could end conversations. When the wind lifted Elena's skirt, the noise around him softened, as if the night itself paused. People turned, not toward her, but toward him, waiting. Julian recognized that look. He had seen it in boardrooms and courtrooms, that collective expectation of how power should behave. Elena's eyes flicked up just once, not to beg, not to accuse, but to check if anyone would help her. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Julian noticed the way her hands trembled around the clipboard, the way she tried to fold inward, making herself smaller. He could have looked away. He could have signaled security. He could have let the moment pass like so many others. Instead, he stepped forward. The sound of his shoes against stone cut through the murmurs. He removed his jacket without haste and placed himself directly in front of Elena, blocking every camera, every curious glance. The jacket settled around her shoulders, warm and solid, smelling faintly of cedar and clean fabric. Julian spoke quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Don't move. I've got you." The crowd fell silent. The wind died as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a space filled with shock, confusion, and something else, something unfamiliar. Elena stood frozen inside the shelter he created, her breath shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She hadn't expected kindness. She hadn't expected protection. She had expected indifference. And yet here it was, standing between her and the world, changing the night before it had even begun. After the plaza fell quiet, the world did not rush back to normal. Elena felt the jacket settle heavier on her shoulders, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. The cameras lowered slowly, unsure of what story they were now allowed to tell. Someone cleared their throat. A coordinator whispered into a headset. Julian remained where he was, his back still to the crowd, his presence forming a boundary that no one dared cross. When he finally turned his head slightly, it was not to look at the guests or the press, but to glance down at Elena, as if to check whether she was still breathing. She nodded, though she was not sure why, her fingers tightening around the edge of the jacket. The moment passed, but it left an aftershock that rippled outward. Security began guiding people back inside. Music resumed, a little too loudly, as if trying to cover embarrassment. Elena expected Julian to step away then, to hand her off to someone else, to return to his role. He did not. He walked with her toward the side entrance, his pace measured, his hand hovering just enough to signal that she was not alone. Inside the service corridor, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of cleaning solution and polished stone. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out thin. "I am sorry," she said, staring at the floor. "This was not supposed to happen." Julian stopped. The sudden absence of his movement made her look up. "This is not your fault," he said simply. There was no reassurance in his tone, only certainty. He shrugged off the jacket and held it out to her properly this time, as if giving her the choice. She hesitated, then took it, wrapping it tighter around herself. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words carried weight. Julian inclined his head, already stepping back, as if he had finished what he came to do. That should have been the end of it. Elena returned to her post later that night, her tasks completed on autopilot. People looked at her differently now, some with curiosity, some with sympathy, some with quiet judgment. She kept her eyes forward and waited for the event to end. When it did, she slipped out into the night with the jacket folded over her arm, unsure whether she was supposed to keep it or return it, unsure whether the man who gave it to her would even remember her by morning. She did not know that upstairs, in a private conference room, Julian was being asked questions he had not prepared for. A board member mentioned optics. Another mentioned donors. Someone joked that he had become a hero. Julian listened without responding, his attention fixed on the faint reflection in the window, on the way the city lights fractured against the glass. He thought of the look on Elena's face when the wind hit, the reflex to disappear, the way the crowd had waited for him to decide what kind of night it would be. For years, he had told himself that neutrality was professionalism, that distance was discipline. Tonight had shattered that illusion. Later, as staff filtered out and the hotel quieted, Julian walked the corridors alone, passing closed doors and dimmed chandeliers. He spotted Elena near the loading bay, jacket still around her shoulders, speaking softly to another assistant. She laughed at something, a small sound, surprised, like it had escaped without permission. Julian paused, unseen, struck by the ordinariness of it. She was not a symbol or a headline. She was just a person who had needed someone to stand in front of her. He turned away before she noticed him, but the decision followed him out into the night. In her apartment across town, Elena hung the jacket carefully over the back of a chair. It looked out of place in the small room, too expensive, too deliberate. She sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the moment over and over, not the embarrassment, but the calm of his voice, the steadiness of his choice. She wondered what it cost him, choosing her, and why it felt like something had shifted that she could not put back where it belonged. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that two lives had been nudged onto a new trajectory by a single gust of wind, and that the quiet space between them was about to fill with consequences neither of them could yet see. The morning after the gala did not arrive with clarity, but with noise. Elena woke to her phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand, messages stacking faster than she could read them. A coworker asked if she was okay. Another sent a screenshot from a local blog. Someone else warned her not to open the comments. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment before sitting up, the borrowed jacket still draped over the chair where she had left it. When she finally unlocked her phone, the headline made her stomach tighten. A freeze frame from the plaza showed Julian's back to the camera, his jacket midair, her face half hidden behind him. The caption speculated wildly. Some called it chivalry. Others called it theater. A few questioned who she was and why she mattered. Elena shut the screen off, suddenly exhausted. She showered, dressed, and went to her next shift with the practiced calm of someone used to being overlooked, even as she felt every glance linger longer than before. At the Crosswell Group headquarters downtown, the reaction took a different shape. Julian entered a glass conference room filled with familiar faces, the kind that usually softened at his presence. Today, they watched him carefully. A senior advisor mentioned reputational risk. Another referenced donor discomfort. Julian listened, hands folded, expression neutral. He responded only once, quietly. "I did what I would expect anyone in this room to do." The silence that followed was thick, unsettled. When the meeting ended, His assistant handed him a thin folder. Inside was a still image from the gala and a short note. The event staff member involved has not filed a complaint. Julian stared at the sentence longer than necessary. He thought of Elena folding inward, of how small she had looked against the night. That afternoon, Elena was asked to come in early. She assumed she was being let go. The supervisor spoke gently, almost apologetically, explaining that higher-ups wanted to ensure she felt safe, supported. Elena nodded, thanked her, and declined an offer to make a statement. She did not want attention. She wanted normalcy. When her shift ended, she stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the city humming as if nothing had happened. She was halfway down the block when a black sedan pulled to the curb beside her. The rear window lowered. Julian sat inside. No tie, jacket off, looking far less untouchable than he had the night before. He did not smile. He did not gesture. He simply asked, "May I speak with you for a moment?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. They walked to a quiet corner where traffic noise softened. "I wanted to check on you," Julian said. "Not as my role. As myself." She studied his face, searching for an agenda and finding none. "I am fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed a tremor. He acknowledged it with a slight nod. "I am glad." He paused, then added, "The jacket is yours." She shook her head quickly. "I cannot accept that." He considered her for a beat, then said, "Then allow me to return it properly." He took the jacket from the car and handed it to her, slower this time, deliberate. Their fingers brushed, brief and accidental, but Elena felt it like a jolt. She thanked him again, softer now. They stood there, the space between them charged with things unsaid. Julian broke the silence first. "There will be consequences," he said. "For both of us." She looked up. "What kind?" He met her gaze steadily. "The kind that asks you who you want to be when people are watching." Elena swallowed. "I have spent my life trying not to be seen," she admitted. He exhaled, as if that confession landed somewhere familiar. "I have spent mine making sure I always am," he replied. Neither smiled. Yet something settled between them, a fragile understanding. As the car pulled away, Elena watched it disappear into traffic, her mind racing with questions she did not know how to ask. That night, Julian stood alone in his apartment overlooking the city, the jacket absent from his arm for the first time since the gala. He realized he did not miss the garment. He missed the certainty of his old rules, and the way one quiet choice had undone them. Somewhere across town, Elena lay awake, jacket folded beside her, aware that the moment she had tried to escape was now the hinge on which something larger was turning, and that neither of them could pretend it was over. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Elena returned to her routine, but nothing felt routine anymore. Each event assignment came with whispers, sideways glances, people pretending not to recognize her while clearly doing exactly that. She learned which hallways to take to avoid questions and which elevators to skip when conversations went quiet the moment she stepped inside. At night, she folded the jacket with care, telling herself it was just an object, yet never quite putting it away. It had become a reminder that something unexpected had entered her life and refused to leave quietly. Meanwhile, the story refused to fade. Online speculation shifted tone, less mocking now, more curious. Commentators argued about character, about responsibility, about what power owed the powerless. Elena read none of it directly, but she felt its weight in the way strangers studied her face. Across town, Julian found that his days were no longer governed solely by numbers and schedules. Invitations arrived with subtle conditions. Conversations paused when he entered rooms, then resumed cautiously. A board member asked whether he planned to address the situation publicly. Julian declined. Silence, he decided, was not avoidance. It was restraint. One evening, his assistant informed him that Elena had been reassigned away from high-visibility events, framed as concern for her comfort. The decision irritated him more than he expected. He requested her contact information under the pretense of ensuring staff welfare, then stared at the number without dialing. He knew the line between concern and intrusion was thin. Elena crossed that line herself a week later, when she received an envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a handwritten note, neat but unpretentious. "There is a community meeting tomorrow evening at the Crosswell Outreach Center on 5th. Attendance is voluntary. If you wish to come, I will be there. Julian." No logo. No signature flourish. Just an option. Elena held the card for a long time before setting it down. She told herself she did not owe him anything. Still, the next evening found her standing across the street from the center, watching people filter inside. The space was modest, nothing like the gala. Folding chairs. Coffee in paper cups. Conversations that sounded earnest rather than strategic. She slipped in quietly and took a seat near the back. Julian noticed her immediately, though he gave no sign. He was speaking with a group of volunteers, his sleeves rolled up, posture relaxed. When the meeting began, he did not take the stage. He sat among them, listening. Elena watched him from a distance, noting the difference. This version of Julian did not command the room. He shared it. When the meeting ended, people lingered, unhurried. Julian approached Elena only after most had left. "I am glad you came," he said. She nodded, unsure what to say. He gestured toward the empty chairs. "This is the part people do not photograph." She glanced around, taking in the scuffed floors, the mismatched furniture. "It feels real," she said before she could stop herself. He smiled faintly, the expression brief but genuine. That was the point. They talked then, cautiously at first. Not about the gala, not about headlines. About work that felt invisible. About the exhaustion of always anticipating other people's reactions. Elena admitted she often felt like she existed on the edge of rooms. Julian admitted he had built his life at the center of them and still felt isolated. The confession surprised them both. As they spoke, Elena became aware of how easy it was to forget who he was supposed to be. That realization frightened her. Before leaving, Julian asked, "Would you allow me to ask something of you?" She tensed, then nodded. "I want you to come work here," he said, not as a symbol, not as a story, but because you understand what it means to be unseen. Elena stared at him, her pulse quickening. She had expected many things from this conversation, but not that. "I do not belong in your world," she replied quietly. Julian met her gaze. "Maybe that is exactly why it needs you." She did not answer right away. Outside, the city lights flickered on, familiar and uncertain. As Elena walked home later, the jacket folded over her arm. She realized the invitation was no longer about him choosing her in a moment of crisis. It was about whether she was willing to step into visibility on her own terms, knowing that once she did, there would be no easy way back. Elena did not give Julian an answer right away, and he did not ask for one again. Days passed, then another week, and the space between them filled with a careful, deliberate silence. She continued her freelance work, though the assignments grew smaller, quieter, as if the industry itself were unsure where to place her now. At night, she found herself replaying the offer, not as a career decision but as a question of identity. She had built her life around staying unnoticed, around surviving by staying small. Accepting Julian's invitation felt like stepping into a spotlight she had never learned how to stand in. Meanwhile, Julian adjusted to an unfamiliar absence. He noticed it during meetings when his attention drifted, during late evenings when the city lights felt less distant than usual. He had expected resistance from Elena, but not this particular ache of waiting. It unsettled him, forcing him to confront a truth he rarely acknowledged. That control had always been his shield, and without it, he felt exposed. When Elena finally agreed to help at the outreach center on a trial basis, the decision felt less like courage and more like surrender. Her first day was unremarkable on the surface. She organized supplies, greeted visitors, listened more than she spoke. Yet every small interaction carried weight. She saw how people responded to her calm presence, how trust formed quietly. Julian watched from a distance, careful not to interfere. He noticed the way she knelt to speak with a woman at eye level, the way she remembered names. It reminded him of the night at the gala, of instinct overriding calculation. As weeks passed, their paths crossed more often, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by coincidence. They shared coffee in the break room, exchanged observations about the work, learned each other's rhythms. There was no flirtation, no declarations, only a growing awareness that the silence between them was changing shape. Elena began to feel seen not as an object of pity or curiosity, but as a person with agency. Julian found himself listening more than speaking, a reversal that felt both disorienting and necessary. The tension surfaced one afternoon when a reporter arrived unannounced at the center. Elena froze as cameras appeared, the memory of the wind sharp in her mind. Julian stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself. Instead, he looked to Elena, waiting. The choice was hers. She took a breath and addressed the reporter calmly, setting boundaries with a steadiness that surprised even her. Julian felt a surge of pride he did not fully understand. Later, he apologized for the intrusion, though it was not his doing. Elena shook her head. This time, I chose not to hide, she said. The words lingered between them. That evening, they walked together through the quiet streets, neither ready to end the conversation. Julian admitted that his intervention at the gala had cost him allies, that some doors now opened more cautiously. Elena confessed her fear that stepping into visibility would eventually consume her. They listened without fixing, without promising. When they reached her building, Julian hesitated, then said, I am not good at half measures. If this becomes too much, tell me. I will step back. Elena met his gaze, searching for the familiar imbalance of power and finding instead a genuine request. I will, she replied. As she climbed the stairs, she realized the fear she felt was no longer of being seen, but of what she might lose if she let herself want more. Across town, Julian stood alone in his apartment, aware that the careful distance he had maintained was eroding. He welcomed the discomfort, recognizing it as growth rather than threat. Neither of them named what was forming, but both sensed its gravity. The slow burn was no longer just tension. It was transformation, unfolding quietly, with consequences that would soon demand a reckoning neither could avoid. The shift from careful balance to something more fragile happened without warning. It began on an ordinary morning when Elena arrived at the outreach center to find tension humming beneath the usual quiet. Staff whispered near the entrance. A schedule had been changed without explanation. Julian had not arrived yet, and the absence felt louder than his presence ever had. When he finally appeared, his expression was controlled, but his eyes carried a weight Elena recognized. They did not speak immediately. They moved through the morning separately, each aware of the other in a way that made concentration difficult. It was only after lunch, when the center emptied briefly, that Julian asked if they could talk. They stepped into a small conference room, the door closing softly behind them. There was no audience, no cameras, no expectations to perform. Julian spoke first, his voice lower than usual. The board is concerned about my involvement here, he said. They believe it has crossed from philanthropy into something personal. Elena felt her chest tighten, not with surprise, but with the realization that this moment had been approaching all along. They are not wrong, she replied quietly. Julian did not deny it. He paced once, then stopped, as if forcing himself to remain still. They want distance, he said. Reassignment. Clear boundaries. The words landed heavily. Elena absorbed them, understanding the implications immediately. She had known from the beginning that proximity to him came with consequences, but hearing them named still hurt. And what do you want? She asked. Julian looked at her then, really looked, as if weighing the cost of honesty. I do not know how to do this halfway, he admitted. I either step back completely, or I risk everything I have built. The admission stripped away the last remnants of his usual certainty. Elena felt the room narrow around them. She thought of the night of the gala, of the jacket, of the way one choice had set everything in motion. I never asked you to protect me beyond that night, she said. He nodded. I know. That is why this is difficult. Silence stretched between them, dense with unsaid things. Elena realized that the turning point was not about whether he would choose her again, but whether she would allow herself to be chosen knowing the cost. She took a breath, steadying herself. I do not want to be the reason you lose yourself, she said. Julian's jaw tightened. And I do not want to become someone who only does the right thing when it is convenient. The words hung there, an impasse formed not by conflict, but by mutual care. In that moment, Elena understood that the connection between them had moved beyond unspoken attraction into something more dangerous, a shared responsibility for each other's integrity. She stepped closer, not touching him, but closing the space enough to be felt. Then maybe the question is not what we feel, she said, but what we are willing to live with afterward. Julian closed his eyes briefly, as if committing the feeling to memory. When he opened them, there was resolve there, but also sadness. I need time, he said, to decide who I am willing to disappoint. Elena nodded, the acceptance costing her more than she expected. I understand. They left the room together, the unspoken agreement settling between them. Over the next days, distance returned, but it was different now, deliberate rather than assumed. Julian reduced his presence at the center, delegating decisions he once handled himself. Elena continued her work, respected and capable, yet acutely aware of the absence. Each interaction they did have was careful, weighted with restraint. The tension did not fade. It sharpened. One evening, as Elena locked up, she found Julian waiting outside. He did not speak immediately. He simply handed her an envelope. Inside was a formal notice outlining a public announcement scheduled for the following week. His name was at the top. So was hers. Elena looked up, startled. "This will change things," he said quietly. "For both of us." She met his gaze, recognizing the familiar crossroads. Whatever choice he had made, it was not a retreat. It was a declaration. And for the first time since the wind had lifted her skirt, Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet again, knowing the next step would expose them both in ways no jacket could shield. The announcement detonated quietly at first, then all at once. Elena read the notice again and again, her name printed beside Julian's in a context she never imagined. It was framed as a structural shift, a new initiative bridging corporate resources with community leadership, but anyone who understood power could read between the lines. Julian Cross was stepping forward publicly, and he was doing it with her visible at his side. By morning, the calls began. Former colleagues asked what she had done to earn such placement. Strangers speculated online, rewriting her life into something convenient and cruel. Elena moved through the noise with a calm she did not feel, reminding herself that this was the price of no longer hiding. At headquarters, Julian faced a colder storm. The board meeting convened early, voices sharp, patience thin. They accused him of emotional decision-making, of compromising governance, of confusing philanthropy with personal narrative. Julian listened without interruption. When it was his turn, he did not defend the relationship. He defended the principle. He spoke of responsibility, of proximity, of what leadership demanded when the cost was personal. The room did not soften. It hardened. By the time the meeting ended, lines had been drawn. Later that afternoon, Elena arrived at the outreach center to find reporters waiting. They called her name as if they knew her, questions tumbling over one another. She froze for half a second, the memory of the wind flashing hot in her chest. Then she stepped forward, not toward them, but toward the door, refusing to perform. Inside, she steadied her breathing, aware that whatever came next would not be quiet. Julian did not arrive that day. Instead, she received a message asking her to meet him that evening. The location was not a restaurant or an office, but the hotel plaza where everything had begun. When Elena arrived, the space was nearly empty, the lights dimmer, the air still. Julian stood near the steps, hands in his pockets, looking older somehow. "I am sorry," he said immediately, "for bringing this to your door." She shook her head. "I agreed to be seen," she replied. "That does not mean it does not hurt." He nodded, accepting the truth. They stood where she had frozen weeks before, the memory heavy between them. Julian told her the board had issued an ultimatum, distance or resignation. He had asked for time. Elena listened, her chest tightening not with fear, but with clarity. "I will not be the reason you choose wrong," she said. He looked at her sharply. "And I will not choose safety over integrity." The words collided, neither yielding. Elena felt the weight of the moment settle. "If this continues," she said, "you will lose more than reputation. You will lose the work itself." Julian exhaled slowly. "And if I stop, I lose the reason it matters." Silence followed, deeper than before. The plaza lights flickered, and for a brief moment Elena imagined walking away, choosing peace over consequence. Instead, she stepped back, creating distance. "Then this is where I step aside," she said. "Let the work stand without me as the headline." Julian's face tightened, pain flickering before control returned. "I will not pretend this does not change things," he said. She nodded. "That is the point." They parted without touch, without promises, each carrying the weight of a choice that felt like loss. In the days that followed, Elena withdrew from public-facing work, focusing on logistics, training, impact measured quietly. Julian moved forward with the initiative, his presence scrutinized, his authority tested. They spoke rarely, only when necessary, their words professional, restrained. Yet beneath the surface, the tension remained unresolved. One evening, Elena received a notification of a live press conference scheduled for the following day. Julian Cross would be making a statement regarding his future with Crosswell Group. She stared at the screen, understanding that whatever he planned to say would close one chapter and open another, and that this time, there would be no shield, no jacket, only the truth exposed to everyone watching. The press conference began without spectacle, which was itself unexpected. Elena watched the live stream from her apartment, the sound low, her attention fixed on Julian as he stood behind the podium. He looked composed, but there was a restraint in his posture she recognized, the kind that came from holding something back rather than putting on a show. Reporters filled the room, cameras steady, waiting for a statement that would either reassure them or give them something to dismantle. Julian did not start with numbers or strategy. He started with a pause. He spoke about leadership as responsibility, about proximity to consequence, about moments when neutrality became a decision in itself. He acknowledged missteps without apology and refused to frame his actions as heroic. Then he addressed the ultimatum directly. He said that Crosswell Group would move forward without him as chief executive, effective immediately, and that he would remain only as an advisor to ensure continuity. The room shifted. Whispers rose. Elena felt the breath leave her chest. Julian continued, explaining that the work mattered more than titles, and that if his presence had become the distraction, then he would remove it. He did not mention her name. He did not need to. The conference ended abruptly, questions unanswered, headlines already forming. Elena sat still long after the screen went dark, her thoughts racing. She had stepped aside to protect the work, never imagining he would step aside to protect its integrity. The realization was both grounding and terrifying. Later that evening, she found herself walking without a destination, the city lights blurring as she replayed his words. Her phone buzzed once. A single message from Julian, simple and unguarded. I meant what I said. I did not do this for you. I did it because of you. She stopped beneath a street lamp, the glow familiar and strange, the echo of the plaza night pressing close. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Julian's decision had altered not just his future, but hers, dismantling the careful separation she had insisted upon. She returned to the outreach center the next day to find the atmosphere transformed. There was uncertainty, yes, but also resolve. Staff spoke openly about next steps. Volunteers leaned in rather than pulling back. The work continued, steadier than before. Elena realized that Julian's absence had not hollowed the space. It had clarified it. That afternoon, Julian arrived quietly, no entourage, no announcement. He stood in the doorway, waiting until Elena noticed him. They stepped outside together, the noise of the center fading behind them. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He only said, I am free to choose what matters now. Elena searched his face, seeing both loss and relief. And what do you choose? She asked. Julian took a breath. I choose to stand where I am useful, not where I am untouchable. She nodded, understanding the cost of that choice more than anyone. They walked in silence, the kind that no longer needed filling. When they reached the corner, Julian stopped. I know stepping aside was your line, he said. I crossed it anyway. Elena considered him, the memory of her own words returning. She had said she did not want to be the reason he chose wrong. Now she saw that there was no right choice without consequence, only honest ones. I did not step aside to disappear, she replied. I stepped aside to see who would remain when the noise faded. Julian met her gaze, something unguarded passing between them. Then perhaps this is where we meet again, he said, not as a headline, not as a shield, but as two people who chose to stay. The air between them felt different now, less fragile, more real. Elena did not reach for him. She did not need to. The decision had already been made, not in a single moment, but across weeks of restraint and sacrifice. As they walked back toward the center together, she knew the world would continue to speculate, to simplify, to demand conclusions. What they had was quieter and far more difficult. It was the beginning of something built not on rescue, but on shared consequence, and it would demand more of them than either had yet given. Time softened the sharp edges of what had happened, but it did not erase them. Weeks passed, and the city adjusted to Julian Cross without a title, to an outreach center no longer framed by controversy, but by consistency. Elena found her footing in the quiet authority she had earned, not given, guiding projects, mentoring new staff, and learning how to occupy space without apology. Julian worked beside her without spectacle, his presence steady, his attention focused on listening rather than leading. They did not announce anything. They did not define what they were to each other. The absence of labels became a shelter of its own. One evening, long after the center had closed, they returned to the hotel plaza together for a community fundraiser, smaller this time, less polished, more honest. The steps were the same. The lights were softer. Elena paused where she had once frozen, the memory rising unbidden. Julian noticed and slowed, giving her the space to decide. She stepped forward on her own, her posture calm, her gaze level. There was no wind. There were no cameras waiting to be fed. They stood side by side, not shielding, not hidden, simply present. A donor approached to thank them. A volunteer laughed nearby. The night moved around them without demanding anything. Later, as the event wound down, Julian asked quietly if she wanted to walk. They moved through the streets without destination, the city familiar again. Elena realized that the fear she once carried had shifted. It was no longer about being seen, but about staying true to what she had learned in the light. Julian stopped beneath a street lamp, the same kind that had caught her breath weeks before. "I never thanked you," he said, "for not letting me choose comfort over conscience." Elena considered him, then shook her head. "You chose that yourself. I just refused to hide for you." He smiled then, not with triumph, but with recognition. That was when he reached for her hand, not dramatically, not as a claim, but as a question. She answered by staying. The choice felt simple because it had been earned slowly. In the months that followed, life did not become perfect. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, days when the weight of consequence returned. But there was also laughter, quiet mornings, shared work that mattered. Elena no longer folded herself smaller. Julian no longer mistook distance for discipline. Together, they learned that love did not require rescue, only respect, and that the most powerful transformations often began in silence. On the anniversary of the gala, they returned once more to the plaza, just the two of them. Elena wore a skirt she chose for herself. Julian carried no jacket. They stood where everything had changed, not to relive the moment, but to acknowledge it. Elena realized that the wind had never been the story. The reaction had been, and the choices that followed had written the ending they now lived. Before they left, she looked back at the steps, then at Julian. "Some moments expose us," she said softly. "Others reveal us." He nodded, understanding. As they walked away, the city behind them, the lesson lingered like a quiet echo. True power is not the ability to control a moment, but the courage to act with dignity when you are least protected. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time when one choice changed everything, we invite you to support this channel by liking the video, subscribing for more stories like this, and sharing it with someone who believes that kindness still matters. Your support allows us to keep telling stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.